Episode of Teacher Time with BRI. Today we are talking about disruptions, which there's lots of disruptions. And what makes it even more special is that we have a guest. So for those of you who are new to Teacher Time, I am Liz Evans. I'm the Regional Programs Manager here at the Bill of Rights Institute, based in the lovely state of Arizona. And I'm super excited today to have our first teacher guest. So Karen Washington, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, please, and thank you.
I'm Karen Washington. I teach at Greater Lowell Technical High School in Tyngsborough, Massachusetts. We are right on the New Hampshire border. I teach U.S. history to 10th and 11th graders. And what makes dealing with disruptions even more interesting is we're on an alternating week schedule. So keeping up with everything sometimes is a little bit difficult, but you can still do it.
Yes, and we're so excited to have you here today because, you know, it's been Gary and I have tons of fun on this, but when we talk about things like classroom disruptions, especially this year, it's one of those things that we just like having one of our wonderful teachers. So before we really get started with that, we're going to start with our first segment, the news cycle. And right before we went on, we found out that the jury has a verdict in the Derek Chauvin case. Now, Karen and I have both made the choice to turn off all of our electronics because just like in teaching real life, there would be reactions to what that is. So everybody's holding their breath on that. And again, we're live. We don't know what's going to happen. But that is something that's definitely on the minds of teachers, especially the minds of teachers in the Twin City areas. And you had told me, Karen, right, that some have already gone remote?
Yeah, I think it was Minneapolis said that they're going to go remote for the rest of the week. I even heard that yesterday. And I'm like, how are they already figuring out how things might happen, that they've already made that decision to keep kids at home versus having them go to school?
Yeah, and that is, I mean, again, we're still in a pandemic. That's, you know, people are getting vaccinated. There's so many different things happening that how it affects schooling is always a really interesting thing to kind of watch and see, especially when things like this happen. There was another thing, and I'd love you to share your story here about another, it's kind of a current event. It's more of an anniversary of an event.
Yes. In 2013, I was teaching students, and many of my students had a front row seat to the manhunt for the Tsarnaev brothers after the Boston Marathon bombing. I was also locked down at the time because I was in a neighboring town, and you're watching everything in real time on the news. It's like, you know where this is on the news, you know where that is on the news. And after a while, I just kept thinking, I've seen the same cop car go past the same target for so long. And when we thought it was over, we're like, okay, we can go back to our lives, we can go do things. And I'm about maybe 4 miles away from it and getting ready to leave the house. And I hear all these sirens come down the major highway. And that's when they had found him. So this was over vacation. So come Monday, you have all these students who are coming in like, this was so exciting. This was happening down the street from me, happening at my neighbor's house. And I'm like, okay. And one of the things that we did have some PD on was the fact that even though you have lots of students who are excited, they think is, you know, like they're in a movie. We also have lots of students whose parents brought them from countries where that was something that was a normal occurrence. So for some kids, yes, it was really cool, but for some kids and some families, it was also triggering in a way because they were thinking about what they had left and what they didn't think they would have to face. And it's right there in real time on all the news channels 24/7.
Mm-hmm. And that's something that, I mean, we're just going to go ahead and pop into our next segment too, which is the art and science of teaching. So when these events happen, disruptions are a thing, right? You get disrupted by the fire alarm or your phone's ringing a bunch or there's a lockdown. But then there are things like what you just shared. There are things that happen in our communities, and how do we improv? So what I'd like, I mean, for this one, it's more of like sharing stories of, what kind of disruptions are there, and how do you determine whether it's a legitimate disruption where we're just going to kind of stop and address it, or if it's not a legitimate thing, or in the moment just hasn't percolated enough to have a conversation about it. So I'd like you to walk me through kind of your process of things happen. What does that look like? Because I think sometimes people think like, oh, teaching is easy. You just do X, Y, and Z, not understanding that especially a disruption is a complete improv act.
And I think a lot of it starts day one. I always, because I'm a history teacher, I set things up of this is what I expect. We're going to talk about things that are going to be controversial, that is going to bring up feelings for people, and these are the expectations. This is how I want us to discuss that. So even before anything begins, you're getting the kids ready for just normal discussion. So when something comes up, they know this is what she expects of me. This is the behavior that I have to show if I want to have this discussion. But it has to start right from the beginning. If you don't set that tone, it can go off the rails very quickly.
And it's one of those things too that, I mean, sometimes even the best laid plans, right? Like it, especially if it's something like you said, if it's something that creates feelings that maybe we as the teacher don't necessarily understand or don't expect to happen, how do you go through and say like, this is legitimate, we're going to talk about it, or this is like, when kids, I think my students for a really long time had a game of whether they could get me off task or not, because I love talking about like the Supreme Court. I could talk about that. I got to be there once, like I got to do all of these things, but I very quickly learned, oh, you're trying to get me off track, so we don't do X, Y, and Z. Well, we're still going to do X, Y, and Z. You're just not going to realize it till the end. So how do you as a teacher kind of go through that process of like, this is a disruption I'm here for, and this is one that we just can't do today?
And I think part of it is you have to know your students, know how your kids are going to react. There have been some classes where I've been able to discuss things and I can have an in-depth conversation with them. And there are others where I have to tailor it a little bit differently because I know I'm not going to have the same reaction and the same experience with that group of students. And you have to think about, does this fit into my curriculum? Is this something that I can put into things? Is something that I've discussed? These are some of the things that are going through my mind. And there are some things where you can wait a couple of days, you can wait a week to discuss. And you really have to sit there and think about, oh, okay, this is how I have to handle it. But it's really on a case-by-case basis. You have to look at the situation as a whole and decide, is this something that we should address? Like with the Capitol insurrection, we're on off weeks. So the kids I had in front of me, they wanted to understand what was going on. By the time I get the next set of kids, they're like, what happened at the Capitol? So you also have to think, okay, if I'm going to bring in something that happened a week ago, how am I going to tie that in? How am I going to remind kids? What information am I going to give them so that we can have those discussions?
And I think that oftentimes you bring up a really good point that when things like this happen, their first line of questioning goes to their social studies teacher, goes to their history teacher, right? Like, what's going on? I remember when President Trump was impeached the first time, I was like, I mean, we can talk about it, but the only thing that's happened is articles of impeachment have been passed. So I'll write it up on the board. But we also have other things that we need to talk about. So if you have questions, you can ask, but I'm not going to spend whole class periods on this, because right now this is what's happened. And in the AP government world, yeah, you need to know what impeachment is, but like, we got a lot of other things we got to learn.
You've got a test coming up in May that you have to get the kids ready for.
Yeah. Well, and I also just want you to be able to go out and be good citizens. So when people use the word impeachment, you know what it means, because I think that sometimes people don't know what these things mean. And sometimes just understanding that, yes, this happens. I don't have enough information yet. So I'm thinking of, like, you brought up the Capitol insurrection. Like, I heard from teachers that were like, I just had to wait till the next day because I was like, I don't know what's happening. And for some teachers, it's happening, like on our coast, it's happening during lunchtime. We're on, other places, kids are maybe already out of school. And so it's such a big thing sometimes that you need that time to process, because you can't always just improv things, right?
I know everybody thinks you can just go there and you can just do it. And I just remember after that, just sitting there thinking, just almost dumbfounded by what I had seen and what everybody had seen. And I think it does take a lot of courage to deal with things, especially today when everybody's, this is right and this is wrong. And we're smack dab in the middle of all of it. So I felt that I needed that time to sit down and think, how am I going to deal with this with my students? And for me, I went right to the heart of things because kids don't know how to discuss. They don't know how to have the conversations and the arguments that are going to bring something out of it. So for me, instead of going into the weeds, I went right to the First Amendment. I'm like, you have a right to protest. You can protest. It is right there. But I point to a couple of key words, such as peaceably protest. And as soon as you become violent, that goes out the window, because peaceable protest does not mean doing some of the things that happened in that case. And I also let them know, yes, we have the First Amendment, but that does not get you out of any responsibility for what you say and what you do. And I know the kids are tired of me saying that because I've used it in many different circumstances, but I think this is one that was the perfect picture of, you have to be careful. You have to understand what it actually says versus just screaming, I have the right to free speech. Because I think most high school kids love to say that.
That was always my thing. Like, don't use that in here because I am not the government. You can't say whatever you want. And it's interesting too that you bring that up, because even online, like, a lot of people who aren't teachers look toward their teacher friends and like, well, what about the First Amendment? It's like, well, have you heard of the case Brandenburg versus Ohio? Because if you haven't, sit on down and let's chat about that. Like, sometimes you don't have to have the answers as a teacher, and you can say, I don't know, but there's laws and precedents of Supreme Court cases that we can look at and we can make a guess, but I don't remember this happening in history. So let's explore together, because essentially what we want them to do after they leave our classrooms is to be able to do that for themselves.
Yeah. And I always tell them, if you don't like what you see, I'm giving you the skills so that now when you grow up, you can run for office, or you can in other ways get involved and make the changes that you want to see, not just sit there on the sidelines and be upset about something. I'm giving you those skills so you can go out and you can do those things.
Yeah. And I think that is, really the art and science of teaching, right? Like, yes, we want to prepare you for whatever exams we need to prepare you for, but really at the end of the day, we want you to go out and make a difference, whatever that looks like for you as a student. Good. Well, that's, again, great transition. You are a natural, by the way. I hope Gary is watching. Karen's gonna take my job because we have you here, Karen. And it's an interesting thing, because I am not teaching anymore. I stopped teaching at the end of last year. Now have this really great job at the Bill of Rights Institute. But our next segment is teaching in real time. And if you're okay with it, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions, because we want to know teaching experience. So we'll just start with a simple one. What has teaching been like for you this year?
That I don't know if I can put into words, honestly. And one of the things that we did, and what we thought, we're going to be out for 3 weeks. We're going to come back. So I just grabbed a couple of things off my shelf and I prepared. I'm like, okay, I'm going to have to condense everything. Here's how I'm going to condense it. And then it got a little bit longer. And then we weren't going to come back. And what we did, because we want to make sure that we reach all of our students. We teach students in 4 different towns, Lowell being the largest, but we also have a couple of different towns. I pretty much teach students from urban, suburban, and rural areas. So we knew that our kids weren't necessarily going to be able to do that one-to-one, because you have some kids who are out in the country who may be on dial-up. They're not going to be able to do that. What we did was we took turns and we had a lesson of the week for what we were doing. We posted the lesson on Monday. And as time went on, to me, that wasn't enough, because I knew that those kids, they were missing something. It's almost like we created this whole community, and I lost that community. I think that was very hard for me. And I'm thinking, what are these kids going, through? They've got, all of a sudden they're at home, they've taken away all the things that we've done to relieve stress. And I sat down one day and I said, well, why don't I give them like a little weekly question to sort of let them know that I'm still thinking of them and I care about what's going on with them. So I started this weekly question, and I started with, give me the title of your experience in quarantine and just give me a little synopsis of what it is. Also tell me what kind of genre it is. I got a lot of horror. I got a lot of science fiction. I got a lot of drama. And all that I was hearing is the kids said, this is going to be fun. This is going to be great. We're going to play video games all day. Now I can't leave my house, and all these things that are going on. And I'd ask them sort of a different question. And it was really just a way for me to say, how are you? Are you okay? Without, saying, are you okay? And now with hybrid, our shop kids are in, most of our freshmen are in 3 days a week. And we have a couple of kids who we feel need to be here. So I'm still hybrid. So I may have like one kid with me, and I'm teaching the screen. So it's like, yes, I know that you're here and you need my attention, but I also have these kids. And I think that right now we're all just on Google Meet fatigue. Like the kids don't even want to participate anymore. It's like, we want to be back together, and we're like, okay, let's just get through this, and then we'll be okay.
Yes. And I would like to say, as somebody who is a former teacher, who is very much a champion of teachers, having to teach virtual and in person is 2 different jobs.
Yeah.
And a lot of teachers right now are doing 2 jobs. So I just wanted to say that to America, or whoever is listening. Really quick, Karen, we have a question because you mentioned PD earlier. What resources have you found that kind of help you with dealing with disruptions? Or if you want to kind of explain a little bit of the PD that you got.
And I was thinking about this, and one of the things that came to my mind was, they don't teach you this when you're going to get your license. When I was doing my education for teaching, we were still in well, you don't need classroom management because you'll have a perfect lesson plan. I'm like, your lesson plan is not going to work unless you have classroom management. Mm-hmm. And I think it's getting better, but a lot of it is picking and choosing from different programs that I've been to. I've done a lot of Facing History in Ourselves. They really do set a good platform for how do you have these conversations? How do you explore, yourself, and how your identity is creating how you're reacting to these different environments. And I've used lots of their different approaches to like ease kids into things. Others, it's been a lot of picking and choosing from all the different PD that I've done and making it work. But it takes time, and you have to figure out, again, what's going to work with your students. And even within, the same day, what's going to work with one group of students isn't going to work with another group of students. So you have to have that basket full of stuff, really.
Mm-hmm. And I will say too that with any disruption, whether it's the little or the big ones, one of the biggest things that helped me professionally was my national board certification. And Karen, you say you have when you're talking, you have a lot of those tenets of like, who is in front of you? How do they learn? What do they need to know? What 10,000 things do I need to factor into it? Because you're right. I would teach my first hour, and they're all AP Gov, different than my second hour, different than my third hour. The objective is the same, but the delivery is different. And sometimes we have these disruptions in your second hour. And your first hour is now ahead of your second hour. Everybody's on a different length. And it's just at the end of the day, it's knowing your kids. Here's the content I have to teach. Here are the children that are in front of me. And here's all the things I know about them. How do I bridge this gap? How do I get these kids to this objective where I need to be? So can I kind of go off that too, because this is teaching in real time? How do you deal with when they ask a question in a class that is a disruptive question, still a legitimate question, but you can tell it's charged, if that makes sense? How do you go about dealing with that?
I think that you have to sometimes just take a breath and think about it instead of just going into it's like, okay, give me a minute, let me think about this. And as I'm doing that, I'm trying to think of what's in that question that I can address, because if it is something that is legitimate, you have to figure out how to address it so that you're not creating any animosity within the classroom, that you're still creating this environment of respect and tolerance. And it's really hard sometimes because they will ask you these questions and you're just sitting there like, okay, deer in the headlights right now. How do I deal with this? And being virtual, I think, makes it much harder because you don't have those kids in front of you. You don't have those reactions. So you're going blind, figuring out what's the best way to deal with this. But I think after a while, you just learn, okay, I can pick this piece out and talk about this, or I can pick that piece out and then be able to, some way find a nice way to transition into what we're learning.
I was teaching, because Roe versus Wade is one of the required cases for AP government. And so I'm teaching it, and I just had a kid yell out, "What do you think of abortion?" And I had to pause for a second. I was like, that's actually not relevant at all to this. There's no relevance to that question. And I'm also not going to answer it because it doesn't matter what I think.
And there's some questions I'm like, I'm just going to move on. My usual is we can discuss it after class. And it's funny how the kids don't
want to ask
anymore.
It's weird. So another question is, what happens when a disruption is genuinely funny and you shouldn't laugh? I laugh. Like I'm a human being. And there have been times, especially because I taught middle school for 13 years. I had 8th graders and they said some funny things that I should not have laughed at. And some days I had to walk out of the classroom and compose myself because I'm a person. And I'm also, at that point, I was a junior high teacher. Like, you expect me to stay stoic? Something in the moment, kids will think they're funny, but you see that one child who has a different look on their face, and I don't laugh.
Yeah.
Because then it's like, let's unpack what just happened here. Because you made this joke thinking it was funny. But that's what everybody's going to think. And it's a learning experience, right? Mess up here so you don't go mess up in the real world. And let's talk our way through this. But do you have any experiences with things that are just genuinely you're holding your face together because you're trying really hard not to laugh, but the kids can see your shoulders shaking?
I think I had just covered the Cold War and we were doing a test and a kid set an alarm and I'm standing there, walking around looking at the kids. Alarm goes off, everybody gets under their desk and duck and covers. And you should be mad at them because they're doing it during a test. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, they've learned something and they're showing me what they've learned. But I think after that, we just said, okay, this is funny. This is nice. I get it. But we need to go back to our test. And I just had to guide them back to say, thank you for showing me that you've learned something. But at the same time, we need to focus on this. And they were a good group of kids that they actually got right back to work. But there's sometimes when a kid says something and you have to do that interjecting and saying, I understand how you feel, but that's something that's not appropriate right now. We could talk about it another time, maybe explaining why something isn't appropriate, because I know a lot of the times kids don't understand why something is appropriate and not appropriate. So sometimes you do have to do that explaining and say, I understand, but that's not something that I can allow us to do in this classroom.
Yes. And I think that, again, this is the knowing your students, right? This is a learning experience, because again, if you went and did this in real life, like there's going to be different consequences. But it's like things that like my daughter says, like when she was little, the first time she said a word she shouldn't, I laughed because it was funny. But then it was like, so let's talk about this, because I mean, we're trying, they're kids, like even the seniors that you have
Yes.
that are AP, they're like going to Harvard and doing all this, they're still kids. And so being able to have that relationship and have those conversations where you're like, yes, I laughed, probably shouldn't have, but let's talk a little bit about this.
Yeah, I've had kids say, well, we talk about this in the shop when I go out, we talk like this. And I actually said to the kids, how would you feel if you were a customer going in someplace, thinking of, say, taking your car someplace, and you hear people talking like that? Mm-hmm. Are you likely to go and get your car serviced? Or are you going to think about maybe finding somebody else? And for some kids, that sets off a light. Like, okay, maybe I need to have a certain way of talking and doing things in certain situations and different things in other situations.
And that's a good lesson of like, your intent is not relevant. How it was received is what's relevant. And again, it's a learning experience, because I'm not perfect. I mean, I'm sure my students obviously always thought I was, but I forget things. And sometimes I say things that I'm not supposed to. And I've gotten in trouble for it. And I share that with the kids, because it's like, this is real life, right? Like, you shouldn't expect to go through life yelling, I have First Amendment rights, because if you do that, I clearly have not taught you anything. So for this school year, then, what did you, because we started the school year and we were still in the midst of all of this stuff in July, August, September, whenever everybody started, what happened that you saw coming? Like, you're kind of like seeing it down the pipes. And then what happened that you were like, I did not see that coming at all?
I think I knew that at some point we were going to go full remote. I usually give kids after World War I, I give them a graphic of Boston that goes over the deaths of flu and pneumonia. And after years of doing that, I realized something was going to be coming. And some of us placed bets like, okay, how long till we go fully remote? And luckily I was off by a couple of weeks, so I was happy about that. But I don't think we saw going remote for as long as we did. And realizing that you have to completely change everything. And I was in a seminar back in spring, and somebody said, it's like you're building a plane while you're midair. And I just keep saying that to myself. Okay, I understand I have to change things, but it has been hard, and it is tiring trying to constantly, fixing this and fixing that. And then I think I knew that the election was going to be a big thing. I didn't know how it was going to play out, or even how I would have to think about, if Trump wins, we say this. If Biden wins, we say this. I never saw the Capitol insurrection coming, because I remember I'd signed off with some of my kids, and I'm like, I'm going to watch the news. The news was on. I'm like, I'll watch the news, and I'm watching all this happen. I'm like, what am I watching? What's going on? And it was like, okay, I know I have to deal with this, but how am I going to deal with this? How am I going to make it relevant to my kids that they'll actually learn something from it?
And that, I mean, I think 2020 especially starting 2020 as a teacher, I started it like every other normal year. Like I gotta get kids ready for this. I gotta do this, this, and this. And you're right. There's so many. I think what baffled me the most was having my daughter at home too. So she's trying to learn. My husband is a teacher. We're all working, and we're very lucky and we're very privileged to be able to do that. But what that looks like, and it's difficult. And there's, I mean, so many different things. I think for me, it really shed a light on how diverse needs are within a community. Because sometimes we think like, oh, this school district is X, Y, and Z, or this school. And it's like, but it's not, because not every parent stayed home, but their kids are home. Like there's so many different factors. I think for me, 2020 and this year, 2021, increased my empathy of just saying, like, I don't actually know what that's like.
And last year, I actually had students who were working. So because they weren't in school, they were out there working, and maybe their parents weren't able to work, so they were going out and they were doing that. I'm thinking, well, they're kids and they're working full time in the middle of a pandemic, and they're students. And I just kept thinking, like, how does 15, 16, 17-year-old deal with all this?
And that's something too, I had so many kids that kind of dropped off the face of the earth last year, and then they would come back and say, like, my parents lost their job. I'm working full time at the grocery store. It's like, okay, you let me know what you need.
Yeah.
Because in 5 years, this quarter, and what you were going to learn, I mean, we'll still be there. Thank goodness for the internet. But if your family needs you right now, then that's what needs to happen. And to me, that's like the biggest disruption of all, right? For students, is having to change their life to make things work at home. And we saw that a lot. And I think that that's maybe something that is a good close for us before we get to our mail, is not only was this year a disruption on all these disruptions for teachers, but for our students.
Yes.
So I would just like to say, before I get to the last question here, like, thank you to all the teachers out there, including you, Miss Karen, who at the end of the day, put your students' needs first, regardless of curriculum and regardless of what people are saying about what teachers are doing or what they're not doing. There were teachers that just put their head down and took care of their kids. And I am so proud to call myself a former teacher, but of the teaching profession in general.
And I think we really saw that we care about our kids, and we'll do whatever we need to for our kids.
Yes. So we have one last thing, mail. This kind of where we just ask a question, and I have not prepped you on this.
No.
It's crazy, I promise. My daughter actually asked me this question yesterday when she got home, and I was like, that is such an interesting question, because they were learning about all of these different things. And she comes in and she goes, Mom, can I ask you a question? If you had to be somebody in the government right now, and we're not talking like a person, like I'm not saying you had to be Joe Biden or anything else, but if you were president or a Supreme Court justice or whatever, where do you think you as an individual would want to go to make the biggest difference? First of all, I was like,
I know,
ma'am, you're going to have to give me like 5 minutes, because so I will go first then, because I've already processed through this. I think I would want to be a lawmaker, whether it's Congress or at a state, because I think that oftentimes we hear about these lawmakers who, you hear names like Ted Cruz or Maxine Waters or Nancy Pelosi, you hear these big names, but a lot of the like really good work happens with names you don't hear.
Yes.
Because they're doing stuff, and you hear these names, but then you don't hear these names. And I want to be one of these people who, who I am if I work for your district. But other than that, like, I'm just trying to make the world a better place. That was my answer for her, even though I secretly want to be a Supreme Court justice. That wasn't the question that she asked. What about you?
I think I would have to go a similar route to be that person who you don't normally hear about, but behind the scenes, they're doing really great work. One of the questions that I asked my kids was, write to your legislator and tell them about your experiences, tell them what you need so that you're going to be successful later in life. And the first thing I had to do was get a list of different legislatures that they've never heard of. Like, we know Elizabeth Warren. She's a name that everybody knows, but people don't know about some of the local people who are involved in government. And a couple of kids looking like, I know this person. I'm like, yes, they're your representative. Now you know that if you have an issue, you can go to them and they can begin to help you find ways to solve that problem.
And it's so interesting too, because I think the kids don't realize that. They think like national government, they think like all these people over here. And it's like, no, we have somebody here in our district that works for our district, and you can write to them. And a lot of times they'll write you back because you're their constituent. I can never say that word.
Maybe your neighbor for all you know.
Yeah. And I mean, we invited ours to speak with us. This was pre-pandemic, and he came in and talked to the students, and it was interesting because it's like he works for you guys.
Right.
Like, it's not, and he was asking good questions, and it's just a fun thing to think about. Like, you can make a difference, but we often think of it like really, really big, and then not realizing that some of it is small. I do have one more question too, because we were kind of talking about, so at the beginning of all of these lives, we're chatting beforehand, but I got caught doing it last night, dancing a little bit, because it's always a joke. Like, if baseball players have walk-up songs, right? So when their name is called, you got a song. And I used to play music every day for my students in between classes, mostly for me too, because I just needed to pump up. But Karen, if you had a walk-up song, what would it be?
And this is a funny thing that I've actually started doing with my kids. And I call it my passive aggressive. I'm waiting for you guys to get started, to get onto this and get onto that. So definitely Tom Petty, waiting is the hardest part. And they hear that and they just know. And it got to the point of where I went onto my Amazon Music and I just put waiting, and I just have this whole playlist of songs with waiting in it. And the kids, I think they're actually getting a little bit of fun out of it. And one was Bob Marley, and Mrs. like, yes, this is really distracting, but I love it. And that they really got something from it. And yes, I have danced one time. I was trying to get my kids to do something, and there were things that were going on. So I pulled up my little Diet Ocean spray, put in some Fleetwood Mac, and started dancing on the classroom. And I'm sure all the parents think that I probably forgot to take my meds that day, but like all of a sudden kids started participating. It's like, wow, she's gone there. So I guess we'll go there too.
I loved doing that. I would always dance in the hallways, and it was always just like, or I'd sing, because I don't care. I gotta be here for 8 or 9 hours, so I might as well make it fun. And then, the teacher across the hall would be doing it, and you'd hear people down the hall, and it just, like, music is such a happy thing. I did always have, when they would take a test, like if they did like a fake AP test or whatever, I would always play like heavy metal, like to get them going. Like Motley Crue's Kickstart My Heart. It's just the beginning of it where it's like, you got this. It's not that big of a deal. You show that test what you know.
Exactly.
Let this take over you. And, of course, kids are like kind of a nerd. That's fine.
Yes, you listen to really strange music. I'm like, I could say the same thing about you.
I think the one thing is when a student said, can you play classic rock? And classic rock to me is 60s and 70s. They were like, no, that's like oldies. And I was like,
oh, I know
where we are. I have come to this. Well, Is there anything else? Because I want to make sure too, Karen, I loved having you here. And
Thank you.
I mean, I love teachers, and that's why I do what I do, right? Like I get to hang out with teachers, which is the coolest thing. Is there anything else you want to say about disruptions or any other tips and tricks for our viewers out there?
Um, I think it's looking at how your students are going to react to things, thinking of your kids when you're talking about doing things what your kids need, maybe what you need, and also realizing that sometimes you may need to go to your administration and say, I want to discuss this. Can you give me some guidelines of what you expect me to do as a teacher as I'm discussing this? Because there are just some times when you really want to do something, but you know that things could go a certain way. So giving them a little heads up sometimes is a lifesaver so that you don't have those surprise phone calls interrupting your interruption, which never works out very well.
And they just start to all pile on, right?
Oh, yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for tuning in. If you like this video, please subscribe to our channel and come back May 4th, where we have another teacher time talking about how you find your teacher community, which I'm always excited for these. I need to find a word than excited. We're going to talk about how these circles form, like how you know people who are across the country, and how teachers can benefit from such an extensive professional network. This is like my favorite thing to talk about.
Oh, I absolutely love it. I go, like I was saying, when we were talking with Dr. Tootle, whenever I go to workshops, it's like a family reunion. Like we haven't seen each other since the workshop that we went to last year, and you're catching up, you're learning, but you're also catching up, having fun. It's like, wait, this happened in my classroom. That happened in my classroom.
Well, and you meet people that you met on Twitter, and now you're like, oh, you're in real life. This is weird. But we get to talk about that, and I'm excited. So our BRI YouTube channel releases new videos twice a week, all things US history, close reads of primary sources. And if you look, you might see a familiar face on some of them. Interviews with distinguished scholars. Karen brought up one that we actually got to listen to last week. I don't know. Days are like,
I know everything's mixing.
There's some really great ones on there, and homework help videos, especially if you're preparing for AP tests. There's a lot of really great stuff to use. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram for updates on programs, which I'm so excited to rev up the summer and the fall, and ways to get involved with us. And finally, we'd love to hear from you. So comment your thoughts on the video below. Get in touch with us on social media, hashtag BRI Teacher Time. Karen, this has been the highlight of my month.
Yeah.
I just love chatting with you. And again, we kind of interact on Instagram, and now we got to do this. Maybe someday we'll meet in person, who knows? But thank you so much for being my very first guest. I appreciate it.
Oh.
Okay, thank you for tuning in, everybody.